Okay, well, some of you know me already. My name's Lauren. I'm a project management intern at Code the Dream, and I'm working on Vamos. So some of you know me from there. You might see me popping onto other projects in the future. I'm going to be talking about QA today, and the reason I'm talking about this topic is because I have some experience from when I did an apprenticeship at a Durham company called Viget. And I was a project management apprentice, and at such a small company, the project managers were responsible for QA and kind of a lot of other catch-all type things. So I gained some experience there, and I'm also working on this for the Vamos project. And the reason I'm really interested in it is because project managers tend to be kind of the bridge between the client and the development team. And I really like playing that role. And I think that QA is a really important part of the process of making sure a product is ready for delivery and making sure that it's what the client needs and what they asked for, so that we can deliver something that's really high quality. So as we go through today, I'll talk about kind of what QA generally is and some of the different types, and focusing a little bit more on the closer to the end user side. So less so, I mean, it's part of the development process, and we'll talk about, different ways that that can take place throughout the development cycle, but with a little bit of a focus on manual or functional QA. So I'll talk about that in a second. Oops. But first, we'll talk about what is QA. So QA, if you're not aware, stands for quality assurance. And it's all of the ways that we test whether a product kind of meets the standards of quality that we're looking for. So that can look a little bit different, kind of depending on who you ask. So first off, you want to make sure that your product meets the client's needs. So, did we build what they asked for? Does it do what we set out for it to do? Does it meet the end user's needs? So sometimes that can kind of differ from what we thought we were setting out to build at the beginning or what the client thought that they needed. But throughout the process, you might end up surfacing different user needs. So we always want to be validating whether we built something that actually is meaningful and useful for the user. Does the product visually appear as we intended it to? So if we're working with a designer, or we have wireframes or other style guides or things like that, we want to make sure that we're visually in line with the requirements that we have. Accessibility is another important part of QA. So there are, all people use the web, or many people use the web, I should say. And people use browsers and navigate websites and interact with websites in very different ways. So we don't want to, only design websites or apps that work for people who navigate with a trackpad or a mouse and can see the screen visually. We want to consider people with all varying levels of ability as we are designing our websites. And does it offer a usable solution? So relating to the second point here, is it really frustrating to use, or is it kind of a seamless experience where the user is able to navigate and accomplish what they need to accomplish pretty intuitively? And then lastly, security. We want to make sure that a high quality app or website would consider user security and what we're doing with data. So we want to take that into account. So some different types of QA. Some forms of QA are a little bit more automated, and you can use different tools that will help you accomplish these things. And then some are more manual, so kind of human-led, or things that humans do to assure quality in a product. So some of the automated things that we can do are implementing tools like linting tools. If you're not familiar with linting, this was something I learned about pretty recently, actually, on the Vamos project. It's basically like taking a lint roller and rolling it over your code and kind of picking up all the gunk that you might pick up, like style errors and things like that. Unit testing, I'm sure everyone's familiar with, is when you, or test-driven development, you might be familiar with that term as well, is when you are writing a test that just tests one particular kind of small component of your code and make sure that it is running smoothly and does what it is setting out to do. Integration testing would be then taking kind of all those smaller components and putting them all together and making sure that they still work together. Performance testing can take a lot of different forms, as well as integration testing, but checking things like speed, response time, making sure that the app is stable, just making sure that all of the pieces that you've put together are functioning well and still continue to function under different circumstances. So if you have a ton of users suddenly using it all at once, or your user base or requests that they're making on the system kind of increase over time, things like that. You might want to test, and there are different automated tools that you can use for that. And then security testing, there are automated tools out there to make sure that you are encrypting data that needs to be encrypted. Things like passwords and API keys are not visible to the user when they're using your app, things like that. So there are a lot of out-of-the-box tools, like I mentioned, that you can use for automated testing. I'm not going to go through a lot of examples for those because there are so many, but those are things that you could explore if you wanted to for a project that you're working on, and see what would work for you. Over on the manual testing side, that's a little bit more where someone like me as a project manager would come in for a lot of these things, but there are elements that developers would do as well. For example, code review is kind of a form of manual testing because it's similar to linting where you're looking at the static code, checking for errors, maybe looking for opportunities to refactor or optimize things, and just giving feedback to your teammates from looking at the code. And you might also run it and make sure that things are looking good and functioning. Functional testing and accessibility testing are, and actually usability testing as well, are things that you would do when you're running the app. So for functional testing, making sure that when you click on a component or an element, it does what it's supposed to do. When you navigate around the website or the app, it's doing the behavior that you expect. Accessibility testing, as I mentioned, is making sure that the app or website is usable by assistive technologies, people using a screen reader, tabbing through the page on a keyboard, things like that. And then usability testing is kind of making sure that the user experience makes sense. So one of the things that I like to do for this is kind of putting myself in a beginner's mindset. So if I had no idea what this app was supposed to do, I'm just coming into it, I've not been a part of discussions about what the purpose of the app is or anything like that, would I be able to intuitively understand how to use it? Or I have very minimal information. When I enter this page, I'm supposed to be able to browse for products. I'm able to do that and kind of understand that intuitively. Security testing, same as automated testing, but kind of doing things manually just to make sure that, if I shouldn't have access to a certain page, I can't access it, things like that. Any questions so far on kind of what is QA or kind of types of QA or different forms that can take in the development process? All right, we can forge ahead. So before we continue, I wanted to touch on a couple concepts that people are probably familiar with. I'm sure everyone's heard of UX. It's a very hot topic in the software development world. And probably a lot of people have heard of design thinking. So these are things, so UX is what we do as we kind of consider the overall experience of the end user. So putting ourselves in the user's shoes, making sure that what we build can actually meet the need that they have when they open our app or navigate to our webpage. The design thinking model is more of an innovation or problem solving framework, but it's another way that we can put ourselves into the user's shoes and make sure that what we're designing actually works for them. So we don't want to just design for ourselves or only look at what the client tells us to build, or only look at what a project manager wrote for like the requirements of the project, things like that. We want to kind of take all of those sources into account and make sure that we're ultimately empathizing with the end user and building something that's actually going to work for them. Have people heard of design thinking before, or has this come up in anyone's work, either at Code the Dream or elsewhere?
Yes, I've done a few courses or classes on design and understanding your user and kind of figuring out what they would want and how to design with them in mind.
That's awesome. Yeah, when I first heard of design thinking, I thought of it as kind of related to visual design, but it's definitely designing solutions or processes or, kind of the whole experience of a product that a user might need to use. So the reason that I mention these when I talk about QA is because it kind of relates back to what does the definition of quality look like? And again, you can see that can come from a few different sources. So more on QA specifically. So there are some best practices that we want to try to follow when we're doing all of these different activities that constitute QA. So going back to design thinking and UX, we want to try to define and understand who our users are. So that can help us figure out what is it that we need to test to make sure that this is a high quality product. So you might identify stakeholders on the client side or beta testers or some user group that can really help you understand who they are, what their motivations are, what they need, so that you can make a product that works for them. In terms of team process, using documentation to keep anyone who's doing QA and all these different forms on the same page. So you want to agree on, acceptance criteria or what the criteria are for success. So how do you know if something passes the QA test? Follow a script or a checklist that everybody can use and follow to make sure, again, that you're on the same page, and just test things kind of in small bits. So one thing at a time, so that if you run into a problem, you know what it was that you were testing when that occurred. Another concept is to build this into your workflows. So as we went through, there are a lot of different forms that QA can take. So you want to make sure that that is integrated into all of your processes. So it's, you build in a lot of different checkpoints as you move through your DevOps cycle that takes into account, does this meet the quality standards that we have? Some best practices for that include using like a staging environment where you can run through everything in an application, and it lets you, play around and just kind of mess with everything and just follow the path that a user might need to follow, and make sure that everything's working. You want to use all those different forms. So, linting, code review, manual testing, all of these different checkpoints along the way. So you want to start early and kind of spot check often. Build in time to fix problems that you might find in QA. When you get to the end of that cycle, once you've deployed something, you want to have some kind of mechanism for a user to report back to you and say, this snuck through to production, or, I have ran into this bug or whatever. And then again, build in time for your team to fix it. And combine the automation and manual types of QA. So here's an example of a tool that I have come up with for the Vamos project. So your team can use a lot of different tools. This is one custom script that we came up with, and your QA script would really depend on what the product is that you built. What's the path that a user needs to follow, like the critical path that they need to get from point A to point B to accomplish whatever the task is that they've set out to do within your app. So of course, your checklist is going to vary depending on what that is. So you want to consider where that fits into your workflow, when you're running a checklist like that versus using a more automated method. Things like team code standards and, again, acceptance criteria are different types of documentation that you might implement to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And then there are some browser-based tools that I like to use. I'll show an example of the Wave tool because that's one I've used in the past, but Wave, Axe, and Arc Toolkit are all browser extensions that you can use to just run through your app and kind of highlight and surface issues that you might have missed just from visually looking at it. And then Browser Stack, and there are many others that do this, but this is a paid tool, so it's not free like the other ones, but this is one that would let you do cross-browser testing. So it allows you to open your app and run it on as if you were, I have a Windows machine, but it would let me pretend that I was on a Mac running Safari with a certain, version, and use all those different combinations to make sure that your app runs on every browser that a user might be using. Any questions so far about some of the tools that you might use, or do people have examples of any of these that they've implemented?
Will you be sharing your slides with us afterwards?
Yes, I will. And I have some more resources at the end as well.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask the question? For example, when we start the checks, basically we are creating the checklist to check. It's kind of seems to me more challenging to make that checklist to cover the like all edge cases. Even sometimes like when we do some changes, maybe it's not, it is maybe affecting something else in the application. Like how we kind of like to make sure like we are really have that all checklist points to cover the like the all necessary quality assurance things. Actually, what is the like best practice to like kind of like create that kind of this checklist to make sure like we are covering everything?
Yeah, that's a good point. So you can draw on documentation that you might already have, like user stories. So those will tell you, as a blank user role, I need to do X, and tell you kind of the user's motivation or why they would want to accomplish that. So that can be a good starting point for what you might include in a checklist. This is broken down into like really small parts, so that, I mean, even just looking at the form and verifying that all the elements are displaying as you would expect them to. So you can kind of do it in different ways depending on what your team needs. So I would say I made this for myself to run through, and I knew that I would want a reminder to check all of those, very small details. You could probably, if you fix something related to just one part of the critical path, you could potentially run just that set of the script. Just, as a spot check, kind of run through it to make sure that you don't need to run through the entire thing, but at some point, in the next check, you might run through the entire critical path. But for just the small change that you made, you might just be able to run through, a portion of that checklist. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it makes sense.
If I can jump in real quick, these are meant to be sort of like living documents too, and they like, the idea is like you continue to build on them and like add to them as you go along. So as you build new products, you might have like a product specific QA run, but then over time, if that becomes like part of just like how everything gets done, you could think about adding that to like the critical path list as well. Just like with anything else in development, it's like you start it and you iterate, right? Like you keep adding to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
It looks like Adriana had a question.
Yeah. I have a question regarding, she mentioned about QI testing and manual testing at the beginning.
Mhm.
My question is different the QI testing and manual testing for the front end part? Like you split in both, like you do a QI testing for the front end and manual testing for the front end, and you do also for the back end part? Or how did you handle this?
That's a good question. So with manual testing, you're actually running the app. So I like to include them both in the same script. And you can see here that the first row will relate to just looking at the form and seeing that all of the elements are displaying as you would expect them to. So that's a little bit more of a front end thing. The second one is entering site data and saving a site. So that would kind of relate to the back end. So those two items in the checklist kind of check a front end thing and a back end thing, and they're all part of the same flow in this script.
So we use both for both parts, like front end and back end. We use both, but we have to define the criteria with our project leader on.
Yes, because by the time you get to manual testing, you've integrated both parts. The front end of the back and the back end are working together, for the app to be what the user actually uses. So at that point, you want to be able to test both and how they work hand in hand.
Okay. Yeah, because at this point only I know the request testing, or I just work on that, the request testing for the back end. And for the front end, when people use React, I wonder what kind of testing do they use for React?
Yeah, we could talk about, maybe have some time at the end to talk about specific examples of those things. And that would probably be one of those types of testing that's a little bit closer to the code, whereas this refers more to running the app and just, testing by using it. I guess that's kind of what manual testing refers to.
Okay, thank you.
I definitely use the browse-based one for Axe for when after I launch a website on WordPress, and it's very helpful.
Yeah, those tools are definitely helpful more for front-end components, and front-end developers would probably be more likely to use those. So I wanted to talk through a couple of examples. This was one that I ran into recently when I started on the Vamos project. So there's really, I mean, this isn't necessarily a app, but it was an interesting, I thought, kind of juxtaposition between security and usability of the app. So I was added to a GitHub repo, and I kept navigating to the page and getting a 404 error. And 404 means the page is not found, when really I just didn't have the authorization to access it yet. And there were like some crazy GitHub email settings that I had to address to get to it. So it took some Googling and Stack Overflowing to figure it out. And it ultimately wasn't a huge problem. But I wanted to bring this up as an example of how the error message I got didn't really help me figure out what needed to happen. So that was one kind of example of balancing security with usability of the app. Obviously, I think security is a little bit more important because you can figure out how to use it. But it was, I thought, an interesting example that I wanted to mention. Another example here that I have is about accessibility. Is anybody familiar with the Domino's Pizza accessibility case? This is a lawsuit that's been going on for several years now.
I've heard about it. It was an issue with using the tracker, right? That it wasn't accessible.
Yeah, so I think it was the ordering system and the tracker and just that whole experience of ordering a pizza. So what happened was a man who's blind sued Domino's and said, your website is not accessible because I don't have the same ability to use it as a person without a disability, in this case, blindness. And those who are familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act know that it tends to refer to physical spaces, but it means that people with disabilities have to be offered full and equal enjoyment of any physical space that someone without a disability can access. So things have to be accessible. And I think that the last thing that happened was a judge ruled that Domino's does have to apply or does have to comply with the ADA and make their website accessible. So it's something to keep in mind that for legal reasons, you should definitely consider accessibility and make sure that your website can be used by all people, regardless of disability or ability status. But also just for inclusion, it's kind of the right thing to do to make sure that your website can be used by everyone. And there are
this is for like all websites, or
so I don't know if there is specific guidance from like a legal perspective on who has to comply, but I would say more from an ethical perspective as a developer, it's important to consider accessibility. I don't think that we're necessarily at risk of like getting sued by somebody, but it is definitely something to consider.
There are some requirements for like government organizations and schools and such. They are legally required to make an alternative that is accessible, and they can definitely be brought up with legal charges and have been in the past for not being accessible.
Very good to know.
That is like government entities are mandated. Yeah, I don't think it's as strict with private organizations, but like Lauren said, it's just the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there is a set of guidelines out there that we can follow from W3C, which is the kind of overarching organization that monitors how the internet runs. So they say that any website should be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So we want to make sure that we're considering those guidelines. And again, I'll send this out and there's a link there. The standards are pretty long, but that means that they're very detailed and can give you a lot of guidance if you're having trouble with any particular components on a website you're working on. So I thought that was an interesting example to talk through, and it relates to QA because accessibility is something that's often tested when you get to the QA process, especially in the manual testing phase. You're using tools like Wave or Axe or Arc to make sure that your website is accessible, and also trying out some of the assistive technologies that are out there, making sure that you can use a screen reader and use that to navigate your website or navigate by tabbing through on the keyboard like somebody else might navigate a website.
There is, just to add on to that, I had to create a website for ALS on Tangle. And our main focus was to allow people with ALS, because they use like special glasses so they can click on things. So it's very important not to have like a cluttered space, and to make things like far away enough where like they are able to click on them with like special glasses or things like that. So that was so now every time that I create a website, I take that in mind, not to like clutter a bunch of stuff together.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the last example I have is a site called Jeff's Nature Pages, which I'm certain probably nobody's ever heard of, because this is my friend's dad's nature website where he hosts all of his photos. So I wanted to actually go through this, and a couple questions that I have as we look at this example. So I want to know kind of what stands out to you at first glance. You can see the home page here. I have a screenshot. So would love to talk through what stands out. What do you think you would recommend changing on this site? If you could, make specific recommendations to the developer who made it, what would make it easier to interact with, easier to see, easier to navigate? And then think about how you would give this feedback to a teammate, because as we do QA, it's not just, testing everything and then making notes and then we're done. You have to give that feedback to somebody, and they need to be able to incorporate it so that they can improve the product that you're working on. So that feedback loop is really important. And so I'd love to get a conversation going about how you would articulate that in a constructive way. So can everybody still see my screen with this window open? The nature homepage?
Yes.
Great. So right off the bat, what are some things that stand out to people when we first navigate to this page?
The links at the top. Is that the part of it?
That's the nav bar. Yeah, this is our nav bar up here. Got what stands out to you about the links?
Cluttered together, and the color against the background is a bit hard to read and small.
Yeah. It's a good point. What else as we move down the page? What else do you notice?
I see no padding for the page as a whole, I think.
You said no padding?
Yeah.
Yeah, so everything just kind of, it's like reading a newspaper or something. It's like stretched all the way across.
I like the white edges on the Google logo near the search.
Yeah,
bar.
that's interesting. It must be like a PNG that has white border or something, but it's on a black background.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm gonna click into which animal group would y'all like to explore with me?
Butterflies.
Butterflies, good choice. I was worried someone would choose that miscellaneous vertebrates thing. So yeah, what do we see on this page? What do you think users are trying to do when they get to this page? And are they able to do that?
Look at the pictures.
Yeah, it is a photo website, so I would maybe expect some more pictures.
Yeah,
These
it's
are,
very text heavy.
Yeah, so it's a pretty long page and we keep scrolling and there's so many. So I don't know what some of these are. Let's look at a silvery blue thing. Yeah, so that's how, we navigate. So I get to this page, I'm looking at an example. Where do we want to go from here?
Back. I want to go back.
Want to go back? Yeah, so I don't immediately see like our nav bar's gone. There's no home link, anything up there. I could scroll all, like maybe I've looked at all these pictures and I get to the bottom. I don't immediately see, I know that this is maybe the home page, so I can click on that. So yeah, navigation, something to consider when we're thinking about how a user moves through our website. can they find what they need to find? Are they, able to do what they need to do when they get to a page? Are those things happening intuitively? I was looking at this recently and I saw some leopards, and I was going to show you guys that, but I don't immediately know where to find leopards. Maybe mammals. I don't know. So I can't immediately find what I'm hoping to find. So maybe I'll search for leopards. Let's see what happens when we search. So we have a site search that uses Google and it takes us away from the site. So that's kind of one thing to consider. Would we give any feedback to the developer about that? What do you guys think?
When we navigate outside, we have to make sure we close the session from our side, because I don't know if they can go back from this arrow. So that is something that can cause vulnerability issues, or I don't know.
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, is that something that y'all need to consider?
Yeah, just when we navigate outside or we open a new window and leave our site in the same place, and we open a new window and we make sure if we are going to get out, we close the session to avoid vulnerability issues. I don't know. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, my first thought was when I leave this page, I don't know if I'm going to go back or not, because like if I want to see leopard pictures, now I'm on Google, I can just go find them somewhere else. But so yeah, from a usability standpoint, I was thinking if you leave a website, maybe you don't necessarily have a flow that takes you back into it, but that's a great point about security.
This is probably a widget that he got from Google and just like dropped it in place.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not been any work to like integrate it into the site itself. That's a fair point about the sessions. I doubt there's any kind of sessioning going on here. That there's no login. At the very least, it would be good to like, if you're going to have another page, like open it up in a new tab or something. So you still like, you can still go back to the original one. But yeah.
Yeah, all great points. So this is all to kind of get us thinking about what we might look for as we're doing manual QA. So I don't have a particular script that I was going to follow for this, but if I were, the project manager or on the development team for this page, I would want to have a script that I'm following to check that things are doing what I expect them to do and appearing how I expect them to appear. If you can believe it, I was told that this website was actually made on WordPress many years ago. So we could probably implement some other tools that would help it along. What kind of feedback, or does anybody have ideas about how they might want to give feedback to the developer, or what would be important to tell the developer so that they can change some of these things that we've talked about?
Like number one, like it should be readable.
It should be readable.
Yeah. And another thing, like if you are going to take the user to another site, the user has to know that. So for example, if you put here input, if you are using like input, the user may expect like you are not taking him to another site. So he may expect the result should be right here. So if you are going to take him to another site, you have to put a link
to somewhere here.
If someone click something, then like they know like they are going to go to another.
Yeah, so maybe an icon here that shows them like a little arrow, you're going to a new site, or a redirect page or something like that. Cool. So one thing that I think is helpful is to give feedback that is constructive. So you could, say that to somebody, but I think making the rationale for why it's important is really helpful so that a person can incorporate that feedback and understand the why behind the change that you're asking to be made. So one thing I wanted to showcase real quick is the Wave accessibility tool. I'm showing this one because I've used it before, but there are others and you can certainly explore around and see what works best for you. But this is one that we can see only 14 errors on this page, which is actually not a lot. You might navigate to some pages that have hundreds of errors right off the bat. So this is a browser extension. I just launched it by using my toolbar here. I can look at the details of some of these errors. So this will pretty quickly surface things that me as a project manager, I might not really be looking at the code. So this can kind of show me some things that might be happening in the code without my knowledge. So we can see that there's a linked image that's missing alternative text. So if somebody tabbed through here and got to this linked image and they were using a screen reader, it would just say image, linked image, and they wouldn't know that it relates to butterflies or anything like that. And actually, if we tab through this page, you can see, I'm hoping that you guys can see where my focus is. So I'm tabbing through the navigation bar and all of these other pieces, and I get to here, where should my focus go next? If I hit tab.
The next one.
So this image relates to butterflies. So I would expect maybe it would hit the butterflies link here, but it actually goes to the next photo. So if I'm using a screen reader, I'm tabbing through and all I see is linked image, linked image, linked image, and I have no idea what any of these are. And then I get to this line where we have the actual links that might read the text, and I might know what those are, but I have no idea that these two things are related. So that would be kind of an issue for accessibility, and it would kind of decrease the quality of the experience of somebody who might have low vision or be using a screen reader. So there's that. The other thing I wanted to highlight are the structural elements. So I think we're all very familiar with, level 1, level 2, etc., paragraph. It's important to use those to structure your page, because again, if I'm using a screen reader or tabbing through the page, I can see that this H1 element is the title of the page, which is fine, Jeff's nature homepage. But then as I tabbed through, I don't know if you noticed, but this nature photo pages is just a paragraph that's capitalized. So it didn't focus on that element, and it didn't tell me that it was even there. It might read it as a paragraph, and that might be okay for the user if it happens to work. But it would be good to maybe tag that as an H2 so that I know, okay, I'm in the next section. And same with, projects and information, things like that would be good to tag as a header. So I think that's all I have for this page. I just wanted to talk through another example. Lastly, I have some resources. I won't go through all of these, but we'll send out the slides afterwards and you can poke through. Some of these relate to specific QA practices, and there are a lot of resources out there because, as I mentioned towards the beginning, there are a lot of different forms that QA can take. So some of these relate to user experience or design thinking or just other things related to QA practices. And then there's a website QA checklist down here that I wanted to mention. This is one of those checklists that will have really a lot on it. So it's going to be rare that you're going through and looking at absolutely every single thing in a website. But some examples would be, as you're testing functionality, does it function as designed? You can check, do all the dropdowns behave as expected? So this can give you an idea of what to potentially include in checklists, and you can tailor your own checklist to your own project. So it again has different types of testing that you might want to do, and I'll let everybody kind of explore these on their own. And then of course there's some CTD specific resources. I would encourage folks who aren't already in there to join the CTD Design UX channel, because there are some resources shared there pretty often that deal with user experience. And as I mentioned, that really relates to QA because it's ultimately about delivering a high quality product to the end user. You can use the code problem solving channel or draw on your own teammates in your own project channels, to talk about optimizing your code and making it the best that it can be. And then I wouldn't hesitate to go back to the curriculum from your classes and just kind of remind yourself what it was like to build something from the ground up the first time you learned it, because that can be a good way to troubleshoot and just kind of make sure that you're doing it the right way, and definitely challenge each other to build on those things. And there's a student resources page on the Code the Dream website as well that has some good resources. So just to wrap up, we covered kind of a very broad array of what QA consists of, lots of different activities, lots of different checkpoints throughout the course of the development cycle, all with the overall goal of making sure that the product that you deliver is a very high quality product. What we mean by quality depends on who we ask, whether it's the client or the user or the project manager or the developer or the many, many other people involved in this process. And you want to consider your own product or the project that you're working on when you figure out what's going to work for your team, and as well as best practices, of course. And that's all I have for this. Do we have any questions?
Just a question that I asked you regarding front end and back end.
Could you restate that?
Yeah, you mentioned that we do manual testing and automated testing for the testing. So I wonder what do you use for React? Because I know for the backend part on Rails, the request testing, but I wonder how do you do for the front end? Both test like automatic.
I don't have much of an answer for that because I don't know how to code in React. Does anybody who does have any?
Yeah,
Or any front end.
Automated testing for front end is hard. That's just like a general thing. There is generally with React, the practice is usually Jest is a library that ends up being used a lot. And the idea is, I think with backend testing, you want to break things down as much as possible, like go like unit test as much as you can. With React testing, it's kind of the opposite. You want to just like maybe load up a page, and given like whatever maybe like arguments that the page needs or like a form input or whatever, you basically load up. It's a virtual DOM, kind of like what React does internally, but just sort of just as its own thing where it renders the component, and then you basically assert that a certain element of like a certain name or like there's a div with a certain content in it. You assert that these things exist. And then there's like helpers you can use to like follow links or follow buttons and that sort of thing. So it's sort of like I said, so like with the backend stuff, it's very much like what this specific function with this specific output. You really break it down. With front end testing, it's the opposite. You just render the entire component and then see what pops out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of, because that's for the React. In general, do you have any tools that the front end people use in the market? Like you mentioned a library for React, but in general there is like a strategic how the front end people do the testing, or there is nothing that we can do.
And there are things like Selenium that like you run in the browser that kind of do the same thing, where it loads up whatever the front end is and then runs assertions against it. But it's tricky because like browsers are so temperamental, you know. I think that's why front end stuff often ends up just going to QA. It just goes to manual testing. Yeah, at least as a first stopgap. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but Selenium, right? You mentioned that. I'm gonna do a research on that one.
I use a headless browser, but that's for Rails. So I use a headless browser, Chrome headless browser with WebDriver, and use that to test the front end for Upstate. We've been doing that for years. So if you turn headless off, you can watch it actually open up the pages and type in information and navigate through the app, which I do when I write tests. Sometimes I'll turn off headless so I can look at it and see what it's doing.
And I think as we saw with this presentation, QA is a really, really, really broad topic. So I tried to give an overview of a lot of different things, but we didn't go too deep into any specifics on a lot of them. I know when we're all learning to code, one of the skills that we learn is how to Google things and how to kind of use the right search terms to find what you need. So I'm hoping that through this, you've gained some language that you can use to, start your searches and kind of go more in depth on the things that you might want to learn more about. But kind of learning that research skill, I think, is really important. And we've all definitely gotten that with Stack Overflow, diving, etc. So hopefully you can take some of these concepts and terms and dive a little deeper on some of the things that you want to implement.
I apologize if I missed this earlier, but I am wondering if you want to share a little bit more about how QA testing has been done at Code the Dream, and what, I mean, I know that I'm more familiar with the Vamos project, so I know we have a very specific way that, Lauren is leading us through with the Vamos project, that you shared one example, but I'm wondering if there's other, if anyone else wants to specifically talk about how it's being used in different projects. Or if you want to share more about your plans with Vamos, Lauren, because I think it's a really kind of good example.
Yeah, I'll share one concept that we've been talking about a lot recently, which is making incremental changes to our processes. So instead of taking all of this information and writing this long, beautiful, procedure that we want everyone to follow, and then trying to like slap that on top of what we're doing now, it's really helpful to take small bits of things that we can implement little by little over time, and start to build a checklist for manual QA that somebody runs, for example, when all the code is integrated together at the end of a sprint is something TC and I were talking about recently. Implementing smaller changes like that rather than trying to overhaul the whole procedure all at once. So I think that's a concept that's nice to keep in mind as you're thinking about implementation of some of these things. But yeah, I'd love to hear what other folks on other projects have done in terms of QA at Code the Dream.
And I'll just say, I think one of the reasons why we're so excited to have Lauren do this huddle is because we want to start implementing, let's go turn on my video. We want to start implementing QA more and better and more systematically, so that we can just ensure a better product for our clients. But also that's the kind of thing you'll be experiencing if you go off to another development shop.
And it is very project specific. So many of the things I mentioned won't work for every project. And that's why you want to kind of consider what your project needs and what works for your development team. And that depends on what product you're building, what client you're working with and what they're expecting from you, how involved they are in the QA process. So a lot of different factors depend on what you actually decide to implement. So there's not like just one toolkit that we can say, here you go, do all this and your QA will be wonderful. But it's good to kind of have a good understanding of the overview of all the different things that constitute QA, so you can work in what's important for your project.
Crystal, I wonder if you can share a little bit more about what you've experienced at various projects or crews, since y'all have been around and worked on different projects. If there's anything else you can share about how that process has gone. Has it been mostly just the automated, or have you done some manual testing as well?
I haven't worked on different projects. I've been on Upstate since I first became an intern at Code the Dream. We have a crew's worked on Upstate too, and he made a lot of tests for it. The idea that I had for Upstate, and something I implemented when I brought in we had some interns join this year, is whenever they wrote a feature in the acceptance criteria for the issue, I would put, make sure you do tests for any methods you create, and also feature tests, which should go into the browser and make sure everything works or looks right, to write those as well if they're doing something that impacts the front end. And I think that kind of doing it gradually as you build stuff out is much easier than trying to cover it after you've already built things out. And though it may seem like a pain, I think it's so important, because once you start getting bigger and bigger, it's so easy to miss something. And there was a case in Upstate back when we were kind of starting out, where we changed the text on a button for tracking bill. We were discussing the language that we wanted to use on it. And it was follow bill, and then we decided to change it to track bill. However, it wasn't changed in all circumstances. If the user was logged out, it would switch between saying follow and saying track. And so like, oh, we missed that. So thinking about things like that, like it's nicer if you take the time to actually sit and kind of, I figure when I make the test, when it's front end tests, I try to think about the user's experience, like how they would go through the process, and then replicate that in tests to see if it's actually doing what I expect it to do, and try to think of different case scenarios. Always think of if the user's logged in or if they're logged out, how it would look different. If the screen was smaller as opposed to bigger, how would it look different? Because you might be surprised sometimes if something looks really good and then you're like, change the screen size and it's like, oh no, it's horrible. I don't know. It's a developing process. It's a mix of manual testing, because I do check it visually, but then I go and I write tests that are automated to check those things as well.
What about you, Cruz?
What was the question?
Just like, how have you used testing on Code the Dream projects, both automated and manual?
Automated. Well, I work in Rails, so I mainly am testing the back end a lot, and I make sure that I use RSpec as the testing framework. They have a thing where you can put your tests in groups and like give them like a title and everything. So I make sure that I'm testing one area, and then that one area I split it up into different scenarios, and inside of those groups, that's where all the tests live. And so through that, also because of my text editor, it can like open and close groups of code that allows me to quickly navigate any testing files that are huge, that are like thousands of lines long. And then for the front end, I kind of just hope everything works, and then once we notice something's wrong, then we fix it. That's my general approach.
Going off what Cruz said, I forgot to mention, I use RSpec 2 and Capybara for the front end testing. Capybara is kind of an extension of RSpec that lets you call things within the page response to look for things based on their XPath or their CSS, like their ID. You could find their ID, a label, things like that. It gives you a lot of options. And it also allows you to restrict. Like when you're looking for things, you can say look within. And so it would go into a particular block and then look within that for the item if you may have duplicates of things. And Sheila has her hand up.
Hi, just a general question on the same note. How do you know that you need just manual testing or automated testing for each project? So you decide that, or you have requirements from the client, or how you decide what you need in that case?
Yeah, every project should probably have some combination of both. So the examples that Cruz and Crystal were talking about, some of those were more related to like a little bit closer to the code, automated testing of whether the code is functioning or, different components that you've written. Whereas manual testing, you want to also incorporate in some form, both when you're writing the code. I mean, developers are doing manual testing when you write a line of code and you run the app locally and you head over to where it's running in your browser and you click things to make sure they're functioning. That's a form of manual testing too. And that's a little bit earlier in the process. But then also incorporating maybe a longer script where you're testing a little bit more comprehensively all of the elements of the app as they work together. So you always want to be doing both of those things. Manual testing when you write the code, as well as automated testing on individual components and integrated components, but also manual testing later on when everything's working together and you're running the app, for example, in a staging environment.
Okay, thank you.
One thing that can help is we have at least on Vamos, we have the acceptance criteria part of the Jira ticket, and that could provide a through line all the way through from the creation of the ticket to testing like by the developer to manual QA to eventually being incorporated the ongoing QA script. So if we really sort of flesh that out and really have a good set of acceptance criteria, ideally, it'd be great to just we could just push that all the way through and use that each step along the way. Yeah.
Adriana, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just want to say this topic is very interesting, and also I know that there are some criteria that, like standard, the ISO 9000 criteria for developing, and I wonder if I know there are different levels for companies that they can get the certification that they're developing is on this level, but whatever I would like to request is maybe if you can create a channel where we can try to implement whatever everybody else has been doing, because in the project that I am working on, I did the manual test and I did the RSpec for the request, but I think so that there is more room to improve. So I would like to implement or get whatever Cruz and Crystal were working on, or Crystal mentioned Capybara, and I would like to learn about that. And yeah, if anybody on Code the Dream has experience, maybe they can share in a channel and we can give a try and we can do better.
I think that's a great idea. I'd be happy to create a CTD QA channel that's kind of broad that people can share those resources across projects. I think that'd be a really good resource.
I know that we're at time, but I also wonder, Lauren, and I think that's a great idea, Adriana, so people can continue to share and continue the conversation. But Lauren, I wonder if you'd be willing to share the full Vamos QA script that you developed, because I think it's a great example, and that it's something that other teams could mirror and could develop. And just a reminder that anybody can take initiative to work on some of the things in this way. So I think it's helpful to see that kind of example to might spark some ideas for other teams.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share it. I would share it, I think, with the caveat that, like TC said, these things are living documents and always a work in progress. So I might change the script or adapt it slightly every time I use it, just to, encompass something that I missed, or change something that functions differently now than when I wrote it. So I would, share that caveat. And also that script was written kind of knowing that I would be the one running it primarily, but that a few other people might also. So I would say write a script that cues you to test the things that need to be tested in your project, and that you might forget about, or breaks it down in a way that makes sense for you as the tester or for your team as the group of testers. But yeah, I'd be happy to share that.
I actually meant just share it on your screen right now, but I don't know if we have time for that. So.
Yeah, we can do that if people have time. Let's see. I think Zoom makes things run a little bit slowly. Sorry. Getting an error with that. Not sure why that is. That's not good. Why don't I send it out and people can, or I can, make a copy of it so people can just have that to look at if they want to.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, any other questions before we wrap up? Or you can message me on Slack, get in touch if you think of anything.
Thank you, Lauren. Do you want to share what you're doing this weekend?
You're really excited about that. I'm getting married on Saturday. And then going on my honeymoon.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So excited.
That was
Congratulations.
I was like, Lori, why?
I'm outing her. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to share what they're doing this weekend?
Chris could give you some tips. He just got married.
Oh, remember we had like a bunch of people having babies? We're gonna have like a rash of people just getting married. So cute.
Right.
God, the dream babies.
It's the